Greetings from the United States. My name is Matthew Kaemingk, and I'm a professor of Christian ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary. With me here is Dr. Shadi Hamid from the Brookings Institution. We are both very honored to be a part of this Kuyper conference at the Free University of Amsterdam. We're very sorry that we can't be with you in person. We were very much looking forward to our trip to Amsterdam. But we're hoping we can have a engaging conversation together about this man, Abraham Kuyper, and the ways in which he helps the two of us think about the politics of difference, religion, democracy, and pluralism. Just by way of introduction, Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is a scholar of religion and politics, focusing on international relations and Middle East policy. He's also the author and co-editor of a number of books, including, let's see, what do we got here, Shadi? We got Islamic Exceptionalism. What are some of the other books we've got here that you've edited?
Rethinking Political Islam and Temptations of Power.
Nice. Okay, so Shadi works at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He's also a writer for The Atlantic, which is a nationally recognized journal here in the United States, and he writes on issues of faith, politics, Muslim immigration, and also the Middle East there. As I said, I'm a professor of Christian ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary. I've served as a scholar in residence at the Center for Public Justice in Washington, D.C. I teach here in Houston, Texas, and have recently published a book on Muslim immigration and Christian hospitality. But my particular connection to the Netherlands is I spent a year studying in the Netherlands and pursuing my PhD at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and in which I studied under George Haring and Kees van der Kooi. So it's very much an honor to be with you via satellite. And well, let's kick off this conversation, Shadi. So Shadi, you and I have been both working on what we call the politics of deep difference. And what is happening today in the West as globalization continues to churn is we have deep difference coming into Western liberal democracies at rates and at speeds that these democracies have not encountered in the past. And we're seeing democracy begin to crack and strain in a variety of ways. And Muslim immigration is often brought up as one of those particular pressures of bringing up new questions, or rather quite old questions, about the nature of democracy, religious freedom, tolerance, and all of these sorts of things. And as we talk about this person, Abraham Kuyper, we want to explore his particular relevance to these questions as well. But first, can you set the stage for us in terms of what is happening here in the United States, but sort of broader in the West, to liberal democracy when we're thinking about globalization and deep difference? What's going on here?
Well, sure. Well, you know, as many of our viewers will know, we just came out of a very polarizing election. And I think that, you know, as someone who had lived in the Middle East and has studied Middle Eastern politics, I think there's been a striking shift here in the US, where I remember when I was in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, politics there seemed very existential. So there were foundational divides over the meaning and nature of the nation state, over what it meant to be Egyptian or Tunisian or Jordanian. And I remember thinking that this was different than the US during the Obama era, where we were still having policy-focused conversations around Obamacare, tax policy, things like that. We weren't as focused on the so-called who we are questions. But now, in a sense, we as Americans have caught up with the Middle East, and we are debating the who we are questions, the foundations of what it means to be a nation. And this is a shift. And I didn't expect that we would be talking about these things, but we are. And if you take the contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, we weren't really talking about policy. It was two completely contrasting visions of what America should become. And that's why it felt very existential. And that's why we no longer see our fellow Americans as people to engage and people to understand. We see them as opponents or even enemies. And it's in this context where questions around and hopefully some solutions around pluralism and how to live with deep difference become very important for the US. And if we just go back a few decades, I think I wasn't alive necessarily a few decades ago, but there was this illusion that we were all one, that Americans were unified around a set of founding ideals. And in that sense, we had advantages that other nations didn't have. We didn't have to rely on ethnic identity or kind of blood and soil conceptions of nationalism, that everyone could be integrated into this sort of this massive Americanism. Now we're realizing, though, that even if that was once true, and it was never completely true, but the illusion, even just the illusion of that is crumbling. And now we're realizing that we are an intensely fragmented nation. And the last thing I'll say just on this point, that I think as Americans, we're not comfortable talking about difference. We see difference as a problem to be solved. That's why there's a lot of language here about seeking consensus, civility, how we all have to come together. But I think that's actually the wrong way to deal with our challenges now, because we do actually disagree on fundamental questions. And I don't think it's useful to paper over that or to flatten those differences or to pretend they don't exist, because it's just not realistic. That isn't who we are anymore. We really do disagree. So I think a more productive approach is to speak much more openly and frankly and say, hey, I supported Joe Biden personally. Many of my fellow Americans voted for Donald Trump. I shouldn't try to convince them to come to my side. I should try to understand why they voted for Donald Trump the second time around. And I should also acknowledge that their hierarchy of values that led them to vote for Donald Trump isn't necessarily bad or wrong or deplorable. So I have to make a leap of faith myself as an American to try to understand what their starting assumptions are. And that means becoming comfortable with deep difference.
Can you speak a bit to the challenges that liberal democracy has had with dealing with populism and this rise of a more existential politics? I'm thinking of the contest between Hillary Clinton here in the United States and the contest in Europe as well, behind these sort of rising populist and right-wing parties and the more center or technocratic parties. There's been a bit of a wrestling with how do we deal with these Muslims who take truth and identity very seriously, or how do we deal with these evangelicals who have these values and they want to live them out publicly? There seems to be a sort of a weakness within liberal democracy to deal with these rising powers. Can you speak to that? And I think specifically the contest between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump kind of captures that in one way. Hillary's inability to match Trump's intensity, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think that some of this deals with how we understand liberalism. And there's a strain of, and here I mean liberalism in the classical sense, not American liberalism as in the left, but there's a strain of liberalism as an ideology that assumes a kind of progressive teleology, that if we have a free marketplace of ideas and if most citizens are engaging in rational deliberation, that over time and naturally we'll end up with better answers to difficult questions. And we can sort of persuade people that there are solutions. So this idea of liberalism as an engine to better substantive outcomes, which presumes a certain degree of consensus. And I think there are a lot of illusions built into that, that history does move in a particular direction. And I think what we're realizing is that there's also a weakness at the heart of the liberal project insofar as we're not just rationalist automatons who have careful cost-benefit analysis, and we look at policy questions in this very careful analytical way, and that we can, as long as we have the facts, we'll all get to the right answer together. I think we're learning more and more that this fundamentally misunderstands human nature. Human beings are believers. I don't mean believers necessarily in religion, but believers in the sense that we seek meaning and we seek ultimate meaning. And it's not enough to just say, well, hey, we're going to have leisure and pleasure and enjoy our lives, and that's about it. And I think that that was very much built into modernization theory, that over time, advanced societies will naturally move in this direction where citizens no longer need ultimate sources of meaning. And maybe this is where we can shift a little bit to what Kuyper had to say about it, because Kuyper was very much a believer in this notion that everyone, even people who claim to be non-ideological and secular and liberal, they had their own all-embracing life systems. I think that that's one of the phrases he uses. And that liberals sometimes think they're neutral and they're kind of above the fray, but they are blind to their own ideology and they don't quite realize what's going on. So this idea of neutrality is an illusion that Kuyper was very much aware of.
So you've brought up Kuyper, and this will be a fascinating thing, I think, to members of this conference. Here we have a Muslim political theorist in the United States who is reading a Dutch theologian from the 19th century. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. I know that you've written a bit on Abraham Kuyper, and you're reading some of him right now. And particularly your interest in his doctrine of sin has come up in your writing. And I'm wondering if you could comment just a little bit on why you, as a political theorist, but also as a Muslim, are drawn to this concept of sin, and particularly, how does that connect to navigating this deep difference? How can a wrestling with this ancient doctrine, Christian doctrine of sin, help us think about deep difference?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I am a Muslim believer, but I also consider myself a follower of Abraham Kuyper. And I don't know if that will sound weird or odd to some of our listeners, but I think it is. It's certainly possible to be both simultaneously. And I feel that my own theory of pluralism and living with deep difference has really been strengthened by my reading of Kuyper. And I should thank you, Matthew, for really being the first person to introduce me to Kuyper through your book, Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear, which I would highly recommend. For me, so the Christian conception of sin is different than the Muslim conception of sin. And the idea of brokenness and human beings fallen by sin, when I was first sort of engaging with that idea, I found it very helpful, because there's a lot of implications if you take that as your starting premise. If we as human beings are broken by sin, it means that politics in this life is a site of imperfection, and that perfection isn't possible in the here and now. Perfection is only possible with the return of Christ. Perfection is only possible in the next life and not here. And what that means, it requires us to embrace a certain kind of intellectual and epistemic humility, that we cannot be certain, or we cannot be absolutely certain about God's will because we are marked by sin. And this is not to say that Kuyper himself was a moral relativist. He did believe in absolute truth, but he also understood that whenever humans try to interact with the divine, their imperfection taints it or can taint it. And we have to be aware of that risk. And that's why we can't claim to know. So this is why Kuyper, for example, argues that theocracy is an affront to God's sovereignty, because theocracy usurps God's sovereignty because it puts human beings in their sin in the place of the perfection of God. I hope I'm getting that right, Matthew, but I would be curious if I haven't gotten that entirely right, please tell me. But that's sort of one of the main things that I take from Kuyper, this idea of the fact of sin, and how the fact of sin colors or should color our conception of politics.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're absolutely right that this epistemic humility is critical, and an understanding of what we would call the noetic effects of sin, that it infects my own reason and my own sight. What that does is it cultivates a humility in me as I go to engage Muslims, socialists, nationalists, with this understanding that things could be otherwise, and my own story could be otherwise. And so a sort of grappling with one's own sin helps one wrestle with, our contingency, our mortality, and it just changes the way in which we interact with one another, or it ought to. And it's funny, I was recently rereading William Connolly and his book on pluralism. Not a Christian, but he is trying to cultivate in citizens a sort of epistemic humility. And he actually talks about the importance of reading novels and watching films and recognizing that you could be this character in this story, and your own story could be quite different. And if not by the grace of God, for I as a Christian, my life would be otherwise. And so it does cause a critical pause. And it seems that democracy as a political practice does require citizens who have epistemic humility. And the tension is that modernity doesn't seem to create this humility on its own. I mean, can you speak to that at all? It seems to me that democracy requires a level of humility that it cannot produce.
Yeah, well, I think that especially if you don't think much about the next life, and for those Americans who don't necessarily believe in afterlife, there can be this pressure almost to focus so much on finding victory now. And this is where I think religion can be quite helpful, that it allows us to suspend judgment or postpone judgment until some other time. And without that idea of postponement, I think we can become preoccupied with a kind of utopian politics, that we want so much from this life and we're not able to let go, and we have to fight every battle. But I should say this is not to say that Americans, or really anyone, needs to believe in an afterlife to take on the insights of Kuyper. And I think this is important because we don't want to presume or hope or expect that everyone will become a believer. We live in a world of sheer diversity. And what that means is that atheists, agnostics, and everyone in between are an important part of our politics. And we shouldn't kind of say, oh, they're not going to be able to get on board with this idea. But I think that there is a way to talk to anyone about this idea that human beings are flawed. That's a universal concept that I think in theory everyone should be able to understand and appreciate, because we know this from our own lives, our own personal lives. We see how we can become irrational, and especially in the sort of emotional realms of our lives, whether it's love, romance, friendship, the way we get angry, the way that we hurt people. Everybody knows that there is this aspect of losing control. And we also know that power is tempting, and power, to use the sort of political theory cliche, power is corrupting. And if we really take those ideas head on, then I think anyone who lives in a democracy should be able to accept the fact that sometimes, even if we're righteous, even if we think we're on the right side of history, sometimes we will misinterpret what the right side of history actually looks like. And there's also, I think, a risk that if we become so convinced that we are righteous, then we may overreach in the name of justice. So we may be well-intentioned, and we may want to address justice in a very strong way, which is good, but then we go too far and we end up hurting people in the process, even though we think we're doing good.
Yeah. So that brings me to the second point that you draw upon, which is on divine sovereignty. And for Kuyper, his understanding of social pluralism and religious freedom not only comes from a recognition of human sin, but also from a recognition of divine sovereignty, that God alone is sovereign over the nation. And therefore, no church, no mosque, no synagogue can rule over the entire nation. No political leader either. And so this divine sovereignty, this recognition of divine sovereignty, is for Kuyper critical in creating space for religious pluriformity and religious freedom, that God alone will judge our souls, and God alone knows truly who belongs to him and who doesn't. And so the state is humbled itself because the state is fundamentally not God, and the state does not have that ultimate sovereignty that only God has. And you see some connections, and you've written about this in terms of Islamic understandings of sovereignty and how that humbles human statements. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. So learning about Kuyper has helped me reflect on Islamic corollaries with this idea of pluralism, and looking in my own tradition to find sources that allow us to live better with deep difference. And just to give an example or two, one of them is that in the medieval era, but it continues to this day to various degrees, many of you may have heard of fatwas, or religious edicts. And the practice for many centuries has been that if an Islamic legal scholar is giving a religious edict of this sort, they'll give a very strong interpretation. They obviously think they're right, otherwise they wouldn't be offering this edict. But in a kind of acknowledgement of uncertainty and imperfection and even sin, let's say, that they'll end the fatwa with this Arabic phrase, Allahu Alam, which means, and only God knows. So they've spent pages and pages offering this edict, but they are there in this phrase acknowledging that they may be wrong. There is a chance of that, because God is the only one who knows the truth. So in that sense, we can strive to understand and divine God's will and God's plan, but we can't be sure that we're getting it right. And, perhaps in the next life, there will be some clarification on who got what right and who got what wrong. But until then, we don't really know for sure. And there's a prophetic hadith, there's another example where if there are two interpreters of Islam, and one is striving to find the truth, and gets it right, they get 2 bounties or 2 good deeds, let's say. If there's another interpreter of Islamic law or Islamic theology who is also in good faith with good intention, striving to understand God's will, but they end up getting it wrong and making an error, which can have, some impact on the people who are following them, they're not punished by it. They actually still get a reward. They don't get 2 bounties, they get 1. So it's still better to get it right. But even if you don't get it right, God wants you to try your best, and you're going to be rewarded nonetheless. But if I could ask you, Matthew, to kind of turn it around for a second here, we're talking about all these ideas in our respective faith traditions and taking inspiration from Abraham Kuyper. One thing that I don't always have a good answer for, some folks will say, well, hey, you and Matthew are talking about all these great ideas about pluralism. However, if we look at many Christians and many Muslims in different parts of the world, they don't seem to be taking on this approach to pluralism, and they can be rather judgmental. Sometimes that can lead to coercion and, in worst case scenarios, violence. But there is a history in both of our faith traditions of Christians and Muslims not living up to the Kuyperian example, even though it seems that if you look closely enough, you can find these principles and they're right there. But then how do we explain the fact that we are sometimes in the minority in our own communities?
That's a great question, Shadi. I would say, and there's a long answer for it. One of my favorite recent books has been a book by an American Catholic political theologian named William Kavanaugh, who wrote a book called The Myth of Religious Violence. It's a provocative book, and I commend it to everyone. The Myth of Religious Violence, in which he really does take to task a whole realm of literature exploring religious violence in the modern world and the ancient world, in which is largely written by modern Western white scholars. And what he argues is that our definition of religion really developed in modern Europe, post-Westphalia. And in many ways, it's a power play to define people who are religious as those who are superstitious, irrational, backwards, violent, undemocratic, and those who are secular as those who are rational, scientific, modern, and democratic. And so if your community ever acts in democratic ways, you're not a religious community, you are a modern democratic community. And if you ever act in sort of violent ways, then you are a religious community. And what this understanding of religion misses is the dynamic ways in which states and religious communities interact with one another. So what is often called the wars of religion in Europe is really, many historians would say, is really a group of states who are using religion to sanctify their violence. But the violence itself is not really inspired by religion, but it is sort of a lagging indicator of what's happening. And so I'm not the expert on Middle East violence, you are, but I think that it's really important to note that what we call Muslim violence in North Africa and the Middle East, sometimes Islam and Islamic doctrine and theology plays a role, but a lot of times these autocrats and dictators use Islam to increase their own power, and Muslim people suffer under them. And so I would say that first, but second of all, yes, absolutely. Religions do cause violence. And what I would say is that in the realm of human history, what is interesting to me is not violence, not dictatorship, but those exceptions to the rule. When an ideology or a religion chooses to make space for another, that's curious to me. That's interesting to me. I think that it is the common story of humanity that we look to dominate one another. And so those moments when ideologies make space for each other are fascinating to me. And I think that Abraham Kuyper and his movement in the late 19th century is one of those moments. So that movement and that man are flawed in important ways, and they made important mistakes. However, they are wrestling with a divided Dutch nation, divided between Protestants, Catholics, liberals, and socialists. And they are wrestling with their own Christian doctrine and their own holy scriptures, and they're trying to work out, how do we make space for each other? And I think the same could be said for Muslim scholars like yourself and Mona Siddiqui, who works at the University of Edinburgh, who's written a lovely book on hospitality, who are looking back into your own sacred scriptures and your own theology and asking, what resources do I have within these texts and within this tradition to help me navigate this deep difference? And I think that, our brothers and sisters who don't have a faith in God, but are rather sort of secular liberal Democrats, they themselves are asking these questions too right now. There is a reflective project going on within secular Western democracy of, how do we live with these Muslims and these Christians? How do we deal with these people? So it's a collective human project that we're all wrestling with. And I think what you and I are pushing on here is this belief that all of the wisdom is in front of us, rather than understanding that there's a lot of wisdom behind us in our Muslim and Christian tradition.
And I'm glad that you brought up this point of religion as a lagging indicator, because throughout most of Muslim history, and also I would just say history in general, societies tended to be at least somewhat ideologically homogenous. Until a couple centuries ago, secularism did not really exist as a conceptual framework. The word didn't really exist. And what that meant is you could have a Christian society where the majority of people were Christian, and everyone basically agreed that the predominance, the Catholic Church, or the predominance of certain Christian ideas or belief in Christ. In the Islamic context, Islam provided the overarching legal, moral, and spiritual architecture, and no one really questioned that. There was obviously diversity within that Islamic framework, but no one questioned that basic foundation. What we're all contending with in the modern era is the irrevocable fact of diversity. And once that diversity is introduced, it can't be undone. So in that sense, we have these increasingly diverse societies, especially in Europe. Europe is a very good example where, until recently, fairly homogenous. Now with a larger percentage of Muslim citizens, immigrants, and refugees, that is being challenged. And what that means is that in most of these societies, and certainly in American society, where you can't return to this old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dominant society, so we don't have any choice but to try to rethink our religious precepts to help to kind of accommodate this new reality of deep difference. And it's interesting that Kuyper, in some of his writing, he makes this point very explicitly, where he says, from a practical standpoint, theocracy wasn't possible or isn't possible in 19th century Netherlands because there simply aren't enough Christians, and there certainly aren't enough serious practicing Calvinists. So there's no choice but to acknowledge that there are socialists, that that there are liberals, there are secularists. They are there, and you can't go back to a time where everyone could have been a good old Calvinist, right? So there's no choice. And I think that that practical reality is something that there's a theological principles that help move us towards pluralism, but there's also the practical reality that when you live in a divided society, and Netherlands being a very prime example, and now America becoming a prime example, we don't really have a choice.
Yes, yes. Well, Shadi, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And it's really been a treat. You know, you and I have known each other for, oh gosh, I'd say 3 years now, ever since you came upon my book about Kuyper and started reading about Kuyper. And we've been having these conversations about pluralism and Muslim immigration and Abraham Kuyper all over the United States. And now here we get to share this in the Netherlands. And I appreciate personally your friendship, but also your deep engagement in Christian political theology. You know, as a Muslim, that's a model for those of us in the Christian tradition, as we continue to wrestle with how do we engage in a pluralistic society, showing true curiosity in someone else's tradition. So thank you very much, Shadi. I appreciate that.
Thanks for having me, Matthew, and great to have this conversation as always. And thanks to all of you who are, I guess, listening to this after the fact. It was great to be able to talk to you all, even if it's not in person. So thanks for having us and welcoming us.
Absolutely. So well wishes to all of you. And hopefully Shadi and I can join you at some future Kuyper conference. Best to you. Bye-bye.